Hey, what's up guys? In this video, I wanted to talk about the widening a lens mistakes in landscape photography. And since widening a lens are probably the most popular lens that you can use in landscape photography, I wanted to make this list kind of the beginner, the novice mistakes, all the way to professional mistakes. And since widening lenses are so popular, not only the mistakes you can make, but also how you can correct those in the field so that you can take better photos later. Welcome into the video, guys. My name is David Johnston. My goal is to help you to improve your landscape photography with online videos. So if you're new to this channel, subscribe and also ring the bell for future notifications so that you can know when we come out with new videos that are going to help you take better photos. And also follow me on Instagram, since that's where most photographers flock to for their social media photo fix. Now, I want to jump right into this list. The first thing that I see a lot of photographers do in their landscape photography with wide-angle lenses that's a mistake is what I like to call chaos confusion. Now, there are two types of chaos confusion. Number one is adding too much chaos to an image. Number two is not adding enough and having a lot of negative space within their composition. Let's take the first one, for example. Nature is chaotic. And you don't want to overcrowd your compositions with too much chaos within the landscape, because that makes your audience very overwhelmed. I've heard it say many times before, try to find what the subject of your photography is and then whittle down what is taking away from that subject and try to balance how much chaos is going in to your compositions from nature. So I like to add a lot of stray chaos in my images. And what I'm talking about with that is a composition like this. This is a landscape view of a waterfall that I actually explored a few days ago. And you have a lot of this chaotic nature going on the right side and the left side as well, but they're also part of kind of all these lines going on in the foreground that lead you back to this main waterfall. Including all that chaos into the corners of your images and kind of darkening those a little bit in post-processing with dodging and burning takes away from the chaos that they create in your composition. So you want to dial that section of your photograph down so that it's still there and it looks natural, but you also want to provide a lot of impact for the subject of your photograph, which is the waterfall itself. So that's a good guideline on how to do that. What about if you don't include enough chaos into the frame and work with negative spaces in your composition? Well, that can take away from your subject too. Just like not adding enough in, taking away too much chaos can have a lot of negative space, and it allows your viewer to kind of get lost up in no man's land wherever they're going within your composition. So you want to try to find that right balance. Now, let me give you an example of not adding enough to your composition. So one example is this sunrise shot that I got in Death Valley National Park, and it has this diagonal line kind of making a foreground in the leading line, kind of leading you back to the sunrise back here. But adding too much down here in the corner is going to take away from that. So you kind of have to realize, okay, where are the grid lines within this image and how can I achieve something that's going to bring a lot of detail there? So what I can do is bring up the crop tool, and I can hit the O key on my keyboard a couple times and get my crop tool down to something like this. Now, what I'm going to try to do to remove as much negative space is just get it right along this line down here. So maybe I can pull this crop in a bit and have it more at the bottom of the frame, but then also I don't want to add too much sky. So I'm going to just try to balance out how much sky versus how much foreground I have down here. And it's just kind of a balancing act in that. Now, another example is kind of adding a lot of chaos into a frame, but then having too much negative space outside of that. And I can show you a different photograph that I was working on to show you that. And that was this photograph of a waterfall in Tennessee. And there was too much negative space going on over here. So again, I just took the crop tool and got down a little bit out of this side edge of some of the negative space of the forest. And I think it balanced really well with the waterfall itself. Now, to do that, what you kind of have to be aware of is shooting a little bit wider than you normally would in your composition and relying on your crop tool in post-processing. If you didn't want to do that, just take a couple different exposures. If you're using something like a zoom wide angle lens, take one a little bit wider, a little bit more cropped in with your zoom, and then zoom in a little bit more, maybe having those three options to balance that out too. Now, speaking of zoom, the second mistake I see a lot of photographers making with their wide angle lenses is something I like to call zoom trance, and that's relying too much on your zoom. If you're not using a zoom, that's fine. Keep this in mind too, because I see this happening with prime users as well. And that's not moving your feet or adjusting your tripod up and down. Sometimes when we're using wide angle lenses, we become so obsessed with the zoom ring on that wide angle lens to get our compositions exactly where we want them to be. And when we do that, what happens is we kind of forget the 3D space that we're living in. So not only do we have the zoom on our lens, but we also have our feet that we can move around. And I would say don't be afraid to safely get your feet a little bit wet in some of the areas that you're going. I wouldn't walk on any fragile elements of the landscape or anything like that, but if you have just some slick rocks or something, or if you can wade into some water and get some interesting photos, I would definitely suggest trying that out. Also, lowering your tripod and raising it back up, getting that level of top to bottom is going to help your compositions kind of stand out. If we look at this photograph again, we can see that I was really close to this edge, kind of working with this foreground cascade at 17 millimeters, trying to get that foreground feature to really come out and be prominent in this image. I mean, I did other shots with that too, having a vertical shot and getting right up next to it so that I'm really able to pronounce that cascade in the foreground and in the composition and make that stand out to complement the main idea of the waterfall. Now, speaking of turning my camera from landscape to vertical, that's the third thing, and that's the point of view fatigue or POV fatigue. And that comes, we get so stuck in either landscape or vertical view on our wide angle lenses. I'm so guilty of this. I try to remain completely mindful about how I've been photographing a scene, and then I'm not going to leave that scene until I've basically tried every single composition that I framed up and also a vertical view of what I'm seeing. That can be obviously very well shown in these two photographs of this waterfall with this amazing, like, powerful cascade that was coming out and creating these water bubbles that I was using as my foreground feature and my leading lines into the frame. Taking it in landscape view just didn't really make sense. Yeah, it looks cool, but again, there's too much negative space on the sides, and my composition just doesn't really fit with a landscape view. These bubbles are coming at me in long lines directly straight to my camera. So if I switch that to a vertical look, what happens is those long lines are pronounced and the vertical lines that they create match the vertical composition that I created in my second image. So it reduced the negative space on the sides and also pronounced those water bubble features that I was using as a long exposure in my composition. Number 4 on the list is called focus dilemma. And since we are using wide angle lenses, and I've talked a couple times about getting way down close to the foreground features, using your wide angle lens and making those really pronounced and stand out, I think a focus dilemma comes into play here, because what kind of focus do we use? My really go-to in landscape photography is just using an ISO of 100 f/16 and then balancing the exposure speed to get that right where I want it to be on my histogram in terms of the light. But sometimes that just doesn't really work. Sometimes you're so close to your foreground subject that f/16 won't even get it right. So going down to something like f8 and trying to focus stack that will get it right on point. Now, if you don't know how to focus stack, I made a quick tutorial that you can see on the screen showing up right now that you can follow. And that's gonna show you how to focus stack and then blend those together in the field. Just be sure that you get all layers of focus within acceptable focus in that focus stack. So when you are in the field, you can do something like this. This is a grouping of trees that are focus stacked together with a wide angle lens. The furthest tree is really far back compared to the front tree that's happening right here in the foreground. And I had to focus stack all of these at about f4. So being sure that I am on point with my focus on the front tree, then the second tree, then the third tree, then the fourth tree, fifth tree, sixth tree, seventh tree, going all the way back, really being sure in the field that I get that right, because one out of focus sliver of that depth of focus is gonna throw the entire thing off. I also recommend using manual focus. Now, using automatic focus is fine if you have just like something silhouetted against a big sky, but oftentimes, you know, I've mentioned chaos a lot throughout this video. Nature is very chaotic, so I don't really trust my camera. Maybe I'm old school in this. I don't trust my camera to focus on the right thing. So I use manual focus on all of my lenses, and I'm sure to turn on highlights on my camera so that everything within focus kind of is highlighted and lined in red so that I have a better idea of what's in focus. Also, using the little zoom focus feature on your camera really helps too. I have my camera automatically set that if I touch the zoom ring on my lens, that camera automatically zooms in on the kind of focus zoomed in ring that I can look at and see exactly what is in focus and what is out of focus down to the very small, minute detail. Number 5 is my subject lens relationship. Now, I think a landscape and your lens selection that you choose can really complement each other very well. And you really have to decide how you want a landscape to look based on what you're seeing in it. Take, for example, this shot that I have of Grand Teton National Park in a wide-angle lens. Now, I don't always think wide-angle lenses are necessarily the best lenses to go for. Even though I love this photograph, I think it takes away from the location that I was shooting in. So I have this foreground fence kind of going through the foreground, leading you to some of these like little rivers that run through the valley, some trees, and then the Tetons in the background. There's nothing wrong compositionally here, and you have layers throughout the image that kind of show an entire location, but I still thought that my lens selection took away from what I was seeing. And this is determined on how you see a place. Maybe you go to Grand Teton National Park and you see a place like this and you think it complements it very well. However, I really wanted to capture how grand Grand Teton National Park and those mountains really were. So what I did instead is not ever use this photo. Yeah, I show it on social media sometimes, but not really using it for any prints or anything like that. And what I actually did was use it, a telephoto version of that shot that I have just that mountain face and that peak. And I have that as one of my favorite photos on the website. So you don't always have to have something like a wide angle lens show everything. I think zooming in with a telephoto lens and just completely ditching the wide angle sometimes really matches a scene and the subject and has that relationship there. Again, that's up to you to decide as the photographer. I'm not saying that one person's vision is greater than the other person's. Number 6 is called anchor down. And by anchor down, I'm talking about those big foreground anchors that we can put down at the bottom of the frame. And they're really anchoring the composition to the bottom of the frame. But you can't just throw anything into the frame and call it an anchor. You really can't just throw anything into the frame and call it a leading line in your composition. So how do you do it right, and how do you complement the composition with the anchor that you're using as your feature? So some of the things that I'm talking about here, you just can't throw anything in as an anchor and using it right. We can look at this photograph again from this location that I found just close to my home, a waterfall, a nice place to go shoot. And I created this anchor down in the bottom. And I like this little cascade that happens down in the bottom in the foreground, but I don't feel like it really adds anything. In fact, I feel like it takes away from the waterfall itself. Now, why is that? Why is it that it takes away? Well, the flow gets cut off. So if you look at this image again, the outflow of this cascade is kind of inconclusive here. You can't see where it goes, and it doesn't tell the whole story of the composition. So using your anchors correctly can, yes, add a lot of compelling features to your photograph, but it can also detract from your photograph. Reframing this, I thought I got it right using this anchor, is having just the cascade of water featured in here in the anchor in the bottom left, and having that outflow still show within the image, and also the waterfall in the background. So you have this balance on the two sides of waterfall versus outflow, and you have that anchor still down in the bottom. So remember, if you're just using a big anchor point like, I don't know, a barrel cactus or something like that in the foreground of your imagery, or if you're using leading lines, just be sure that those leading lines go somewhere, like point to your subject, and not just get lost in the forest or in the trees. And also, if you're using an anchor, if it's just one point, have it kind of centered in the frame or take up the entire foreground going from left side to right side. If you're using an outflow and a waterfall, just be sure that your full story is being told and you're not blocking off any of that story as well. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, guys, and watch for more videos like this. Thank you so much for joining. If you got any value out of this video, hit the like button. And again, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell.